In late 2019, at one of the most visited museums on Earth, workers arrived quietly, without press releases, without any public announcement scheduled in advance, and began removing a single family name that had been carved into stone, etched into glass, and printed on donor plaques for nearly half a century. The name was Sackler, and for decades it had been one of the most respected names in philanthropy anywhere in the world, attached to wings and galleries and university buildings from New York to Paris to Oxford. Within about 2 years, that same name would be stripped from nearly every major institution that had ever proudly displayed it: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Louvre, the Guggenheim, the Smithsonian, Tate Galleries in London, universities on 2 continents. Not because a court ordered it, and not because the family had lost its fortune. The Sacklers remained, by most accounts, billionaires. What they lost was something no lawsuit had ever been designed to protect, and something no fortune, however large, could simply buy back. That is the detail that makes this story different from every other one in this series. The Vanderbilts lost the money. Kruger's fortune turned out to be largely fictional. The Guggenheims kept the money, but lost the ability to act as one family. The Sacklers kept the fortune, kept the family, kept the businesses, and still watched their own name get physically erased from the walls of the world's greatest cultural institutions in a span of only a couple of years by people who owed the family nothing and answered to no court. This is a story about the one asset even the most careful dynasty can never fully protect: a reputation. And about the specific deliberate mechanism the family used to build that reputation in the first place, a mechanism that worked brilliantly for decades, right up until the moment it turned into the very thing that made the fall total. So ask the real question sitting underneath this story. How does a family spend decades and hundreds of millions of dollars building one of the most respected names in the art world, carved permanently, it seemed, into the walls of the greatest museums on Earth, and then watch that same name vanish from those same walls within 24 months? The answer is not simply that the truth came out. Plenty of families survive uncomfortable truths. The answer lies in exactly what kind of asset a name on a museum wall actually is, and in the difference between owning something and merely being allowed, for as long as nobody objects, to have it displayed. To understand the mechanism, you have to start with the man who built it, and he built 2 things at once: a fortune and the entire modern playbook for how that fortune would eventually be defended. Arthur Sackler was a psychiatrist by training who moved into advertising and pharmaceutical marketing in the middle of the 20th century, and he is widely credited, across the industry, with essentially inventing modern drug marketing as it exists today. He pioneered techniques that treated doctors themselves as the target customer, flooding medical journals and physicians' offices with material designed to make new medications feel not just effective, but respectable, mainstream, and safe. He helped turn Valium into one of the best-selling drugs in American history using exactly this approach. And with the fortune this generated, he began, decades before the events that would later define the family name, funding museums, wings, and academic institutions, methodically and generously, across the world. One of his most famous gifts helped bring an entire ancient Egyptian temple, moved stone by stone, into a purpose-built wing of a major New York museum. An extraordinary act of cultural philanthropy that, for decades, was simply how most of the public understood the Sackler name, if they had heard it at all. Here is a detail that complicates the easy version of this story, and it matters for accuracy. Arthur Sackler died in 1987, nearly a decade before OxyContin ever reached the market, and his branch of the family had, by most accounts, already sold its stake in the company that would later produce the drug. The Purdue Pharma of the OxyContin era was run primarily by his 2 brothers and their own descendants, a different branch of the same extended family. Yet because all 3 brothers had spent decades building philanthropy under the same shared surname, appearing side by side on the same donor lists and the same gala programs for years, the public reckoning that eventually came made little distinction between branches, and institutions bearing Arthur's name found themselves swept into the same reputational collapse regardless of which branch had actually funded them. Here is the invisible mechanism sitting underneath the whole story. A donation to a museum is not simply generosity. It is also, whether stated openly or not, a transaction, one that exchanges money for something the family could not otherwise buy at any price: permanent, physical, public association with culture, taste, and legitimacy. Once your name is carved into a wing of a major museum, it does not simply sit there quietly. It works for you, continuously, every single day, in front of millions of visitors who will never once ask where the money came from. For decades, that was precisely the function this philanthropy served for the Sackler family, and it worked exactly as designed. You might assume a strategy like that only matters if something eventually goes wrong. For years, it seemed like nothing ever would. The wings kept opening. The name kept spreading. And then, in 1996, a different branch of the same extended family's company, Purdue Pharma, released a new prescription painkiller onto the American market, a powerful timed-release opioid called OxyContin, marketed aggressively to doctors as safer and less addictive than older opioid medications, a claim that later court proceedings and unsealed internal documents would allege the company's own research did not fully support. According to court filings and internal documents made public through later litigation, Purdue's sales representatives were trained and incentivized to promote the drug heavily to physicians, with sales bonuses reportedly tied to prescription volume in individual doctors' territories. The company reportedly maintained detailed internal databases tracking which physicians prescribed the most opioids in a given region, then directed sales representatives to visit those same high-volume prescribers repeatedly, according to court records, sometimes multiple times in a single month, a standard pharmaceutical industry practice known within the trade as detailing, deployed here, according to later litigation, with unusual intensity and focus. Prescriptions climbed sharply through the late 1990s and into the 2000s. So, according to public health data gathered over the same period, did opioid overdose deaths across the United States, a crisis public health officials would eventually describe as one of the deadliest drug epidemics in the country's history, one that unfolded over 2 decades, involved multiple classes of opioids beyond this single product, and by most public health accounting touched nearly every community in the nation, with cumulative deaths over the following decades reaching into the hundreds of thousands. The first wave of serious legal trouble arrived in the mid-2000s, when Purdue Pharma and several executives pleaded guilty to federal charges related to how the drug had been marketed, and the company paid several $100 million in fines. For years afterward, the family's public philanthropy continued largely undisturbed. The two threads of the story, the growing opioid crisis and the still expanding museum wings bearing the family name, running in full public view without much connecting them together in most people's minds. That distance between the two threads is itself part of the mechanism. A respected name on a museum wall does real work insulating the rest of a family's activities from scrutiny for exactly as long as nobody looks closely enough to connect them. The distance began closing for good in the 2010s, as journalists, state attorneys general, and eventually federal prosecutors pursued a wave of new lawsuits against Purdue Pharma and, in an unusually aggressive legal step, against members of the Sackler family personally. Sealed internal company documents and depositions became public through these proceedings, revealing, according to court filings and investigative reporting, a level of direct family involvement in marketing strategy and awareness of addiction risk far closer to the center of the company than the family's public image as detached, generous benefactors had ever suggested. Once those documents became public record, they could not be donated away, settled quietly, or curated out of the story the way a difficult topic might once have been managed through careful public relations. And this is the moment the mechanism this story turns on becomes visible. As public pressure mounted, museum by museum, university by university, institutions that had never been ordered by any court to do anything began independently announcing they would stop accepting new Sackler donations, and then, one after another, that they would remove the family's name from existing buildings and galleries entirely. Major museums in New York, in Paris, in London, a leading modern art institution, the National Institution in Washington, historic universities on 2 continents. Each removal followed a similar quiet pattern, a board vote rarely announced in advance, workmen arriving on an ordinary weekday morning, a bronze plaque unscrewed from a wall or a carved inscription simply covered rather than physically chiseled away, the empty space where a name had sat for decades, sometimes left conspicuously bare for months before any replacement lettering ever appeared. No single lawsuit forced any of them to do this. No court had the authority to compel a museum to rename its own wing. Each institution simply decided, on its own, that the name was no longer worth the association, and once one prominent institution moved, the rest followed within months. This pattern of turning a fortune into cultural permanence through museum philanthropy did not begin with the Sacklers. It is in fact one of the oldest tricks in the entire history covered by this series. The great industrial fortunes of the Gilded Age, the Fricks, the Mellons, the Guggenheims among them, all followed some version of the same playbook, converting money earned in unglamorous or controversial industries into wings, collections, and buildings that would let their names be remembered for beauty rather than for how the fortune was actually made. It usually worked for exactly as long as the public was willing to leave the question of origin unasked. The Sacklers were simply the most recent, and by far the fastest case where the public finally asked. There is a particular irony worth noting here, one that connects directly to an earlier fortune in this series. One of the institutions that ultimately removed the Sackler name from its walls carried the name of another dynasty already covered in this series, the Guggenheims, a family whose own controlling structure had scattered across 7 sons and dozens of partners decades earlier. Two entirely different mechanisms of dynastic collapse, diversification without control on one side, reputation without ownership on the other, ended up sharing the same institution's history. You might assume at this point that institutions only act this fast when a court finally forces their hand. That is precisely what makes this case worth studying closely. No single ruling ever ordered a single plaque removed. Every one of those decisions was voluntary, made by museum boards and university trustees reading the same headlines everyone else was reading, deciding independently that continued association carried more cost than the money had ever been worth. Here is the universal law hiding underneath the stone and the donor plaques. A fortune can be protected by trusts, by holding companies, by lawyers, by settlements, by decades of careful legal structuring, and often it is. A reputation cannot be protected that way because a reputation is not actually owned by the person who built it. It is held, on loan, in the minds and institutions of everyone else, and it can be recalled by any one of them, at any moment, the instant the story attached to it changes. The Sacklers had built one of the most carefully engineered reputations in modern philanthropy. What they had not built, because no family ever truly can, was a legal claim to keep it. Compare that to a family that built its fortune from an industry just as controversial in its own era. The Rockefellers made their money from Standard Oil, a company broken apart by the government itself for illegal monopoly practices. Its founder, one of the most publicly reviled businessmen of his own time, accused in the press of ruthless, predatory tactics that in some respects echo the criticism later leveled at Purdue's own sales practices. And yet the Rockefeller name endures today on universities, hospitals, and cultural institutions with barely a fraction of the controversy now attached to the Sackler name. The difference was never simply time passing, though a century of distance certainly helped. It was also, historians and reputation researchers have noted, how each family's foundation eventually chose to engage publicly with its own origins, funding independent research, disclosure, and institutions that operated with real distance from family control, rather than relying primarily on the physical permanence of a name on a wall to do the defending. In 2020, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to federal criminal charges connected to how OxyContin had been marketed and sold, one of the largest such admissions by a pharmaceutical company in American history. In the years that followed, members of the Sackler family agreed, without admitting personal wrongdoing, to a multi-billion-dollar settlement intended to fund opioid treatment and abatement programs across the country, a legal process that stretched on for years through bankruptcy courts and appeals as victims' families, state governments, and the family's own lawyers fought over exactly how much protection from further lawsuits the settlement would grant. The family, by most public estimates, remained enormously wealthy throughout the entire process, and even that settlement did not end the story cleanly. In 2024, the country's highest court intervened directly in the case, rejecting a key legal protection the settlement had been built around, a provision that would have shielded family members from any further personal lawsuits in exchange for their contribution to the fund. The ruling sent the entire settlement back into negotiation, years after the original deal had first been announced, extending a legal reckoning that had already run for the better part of a decade, with still no fully final resolution in sight. So look again at what was actually lost, because it was never the fortune itself. It was the specific, carefully built asset the fortune had spent 2 generations purchasing, a name that could walk into any great museum on earth and be treated as though it belonged there by right, rather than by transaction. That asset, once it depended entirely on public goodwill rather than any legal document, turned out to have no more permanence than the goodwill itself. The moment the public story changed, the asset simply stopped existing, in city after city, institution after institution, nearly all at once. That is the principle sitting underneath this entire story, the one worth carrying into every other dynasty the series has covered. Money, once it is truly yours, tends to stay yours until you spend it, lose it, or give it away. A good name is different. It is never actually purchased outright. It is rented continuously from the public and the institutions willing to display it, and the rent is paid not in dollars, but in the ongoing willingness of the story around your fortune to remain a flattering one. The instant that story changes, the lease can be terminated by the landlord, with no notice required, and no amount of money already spent can force a renewal. There is a further layer worth sitting with here, because it applies to every dynasty in this series, not only this one. Every family in this collection eventually discovered that some part of what they believed they had permanently secured, control, cash flow, unity, or now, reputation, turned out to be conditional the entire time, resting on an assumption nobody had ever bothered to test until circumstances forced the question. The asset felt solid for exactly as long as nobody pulled on the thread. Once someone finally did, in every single case covered in this series, the fortune's real foundation turned out to be thinner than anyone building on top of it had ever imagined. Whether that foundation was a locked drawer, a scattered network of subsidiaries, a single overworked heir, or in this case, the simple, unwritten goodwill of a few dozen museum boards who had never signed anything promising to keep a name on a wall forever. So think back to that quiet morning in 2019, workers arriving without ceremony to remove a single family's name from a wall it had occupied for decades. Nobody seized the family's bank accounts that morning. Nobody took away their houses or their businesses. The Sacklers remained, by every financial measure, one of the wealthiest families in America. What vanished, in the space of about 2 years, across a dozen of the greatest cultural institutions on Earth, was the one thing that fortune had spent 2 generations trying to buy permanently, and the one thing, it turned out, that a fortune of any size was never actually able to purchase in the first place, not the money. The right to be remembered the way you would like to be, that was never for sale. It was only ever, quietly, on loan, and the landlord, in the end, always reserves the right to ask for the keys back.